Hi, my name is Sophia Dodge, and today I will be presenting an analysis of rhetoric in archaeology. So to start, archaeology is a highly visible subdiscipline of anthropology. Anthropology has four disciplines within it. Archaeology is one of them. And when a lot of people think of archaeology, they think of Indiana Jones. They think about going to a museum. They might think about National Geographic. But what people need to realize is that those presentations of archaeology are meant for consumption by the public, for lay people. So when we look at academic journals in archaeology, they're going to be a lot less consumable. They use specialized writing tactics that are suited to other archaeologists. And many archaeologists use past research as building blocks for their own more current research, which gives even more coding and more complex language because then you've got the added layer of, are they going to speak differently in this time? Is the language going to be automatically more different? And there, of course, may be more modern technical language as well. And another interesting thing about archaeology and archaeological writing is that it has the unique job of synthesizing large amounts of qualitative and quantitative information. So, in a single paper, you may see radiocarbon dating results, historical documentation, direct quotes from those historical documentations, just observations from the archaeologist about an artifact, and dig data. And those are all brought together to fully analyze a site or an artifact. So in order to look at rhetoric in this discipline, we're going to analyze three articles. One is New Dates for Old Butter, and this is by Sinnott and Sikora, published in 2018. We are also going to look at Bog Butter, Why Was It Buried, by Downey and O'Sullivan in 2019. And we are also going to look at A Survey of Published Reasons for Burying Butter in Bogs by Sinnott in 2010. And then in order to look at the actual rhetoric, we're going to divide that up into four portions. First, we're going to talk about structural cues. How are the papers organized? Second, we're going to talk about the argument and purpose of the papers. Why are they writing and how do they prove their point? Then we're going to look at stylistic features. How is the paper written? What grammatical methods are employed? And then lastly, we're going to look at citations and how the author establishes credibility. So let's start with structural cues. How are the papers organized? Archaeology papers tend to be highly segmented. They, of course, always start with an introduction. Some of these introductions may be unlabeled and they'll just jump right into general information. But most of the time after that, there are little individual subheadings dividing each topic. There may also be further divisions within the paragraph. Sometimes there are bullet pointed lists. Other times there may be a little subheading within the subheading in italics. But these papers are highly specific in the way that they segment their topics. Some individual deep dives, for example, in Bog Butter, Why Was It Buried by Downey and O'Sullivan, they divide theirs into an introduction, which is unlabeled, and then they move on to the dating profiles of the butter, composition, the purpose of the artifact, and then they have a conclusion. And then in New Dates for Old Butter by Sinnott and Sikora, they do something similar by dividing it into introduction, new radiocarbon dates, provenance of individual artifacts. So they go one by one from each finding of a similar artifact. And then they talk about the earliest discoveries of this kind of artifacts, and then they synthesize that all in a conclusion. And this highly segmented approach allows specific aspects of research to be easily located and expanded upon heartily before synthesis. An interesting thing about archaeology papers is that the conclusion acts as a synthesis section. So you're going to see really detailed presentation of each of these individual aspects of what they're talking about in each of these subsections, but they actually don't tend to fully make their argument, their synthesized argument, right until the conclusion. Visual aids are also sometimes employed to further support what they're saying, and this can be in the form of photographs or drawings of the artifact or sometimes maps. They also might be pictures of the situation that something was found in. So these are some examples from the papers that I have selected. The barrel is actually a barrel of butter. I believe it's from the Bronze Age, and that is from Downey and O'Sullivan's article. And the map, as well as this picture of a landowner who found a really prolific cauldron in this region. That's a picture of him and where he found the cauldron. So that can also help to give people a really clear vision of what this artifact looks like, what those dimensions are going to be, what kind of environment that they're dealing with. They can really help further illustrate the author's point. So then we're going to move on to argument and purpose. Why are they writing and how do they prove their point? Information always takes a central role in archaeological writing. So they really tend to focus on what they know objectively and their observations. And most of the paper is focused on conveying information. And the argument is made in the conclusion, like I said before. In O'Sullivan and Downey's paper, they take the reader through all supported theories of use of the bog butter, and they only present their favorite theory in the conclusion. But these little individual sections really allow for them to not oversimplify the really complex issue that they're talking about. And the evidence, because most of the paper is information rooted, the evidence is presented throughout the paper to draw these conclusions. And the evidence that they tend to favor, is data driven. So it'll be radiocarbon dating, the archaeologist's observations. Now that could mean anything from measurements to color, and also supportive history documentation, which could be maybe someone wrote a journal entry about it or mentioned it in passing in something else that they've written. That is very helpful in terms of archaeology and what we know of objects. And another interesting thing about archaeological writings is that they resemble both a research paper and an exploratory synthesis paper. Because it is rooted in information and research, that's why I say research paper, but the exploratory synthesis really comes from the fact that they don't tend to make their argument until the end. So let's move on to stylistic features. How is the paper written and what grammatical methods are employed? Archaeology papers tend to be in the third person and an active voice. Sinnott and Sikora give an example of this in their paper. They wrote, finds of bog butter and associated vessels have a long history. They feature in antiquarian literature and in the catalogues of the Royal Irish Academy and the National Museum of Ireland of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Now from this, you can see it's both an active and third person, and it gives it a really academic tone. It makes it seem very objective, and it also brings a topicality to it. Most of the times in archaeology, what we're talking about is very old. When something is an active voice, though, it sort of makes it seem more present and like this is a current discovery. And it is a current discovery, but they're also building off of a lot of old information. And some specialized language is employed. Even in this small quote, we can see they say antiquarian literature. Most people wouldn't know off the top of their head what that means, but antiquarianism is one of the roots of archaeology. People used to have curiosity cabinets, and that's an antiquarian attitude. They weren't actually looking for any sort of knowledge from these objects. They were looking to simply hold antiquities, things that were rare and beautiful. So antiquarian literature is a great example of some of the specialized language that's used. Other examples is their specialized terms for ritual use of objects, and a lot of radiocarbon dating terms are considered specialized terms that a layperson might not necessarily know. And in archaeological writing, complex sentence structure is also employed because it's necessary in order to make some of these terms make sense. And then lastly, let's go over citations and credibility. How does the author establish themselves as a credible source? There are a couple ways that they do this. There are extensive references. As I said before, a lot of archaeology is building off of what we know previously. So an original find of bog butter might have been found late 1700s, early 1800s, but we are still finding those artifacts now. So there is going to be a lot of previous research, a lot of previous thoughts, and so there are a lot of things that need to be referenced, a lot of things that need to be considered. So in these articles, especially, there are extensive references. They do in text references, usually through parenthetical citations, and there's also a list of references at the end. This is in APA format, and it usually happens right after the conclusion paragraph, right after the final paragraph. There was only one out of the three papers where it was even set on a different page, and that one was because there was such an extensive list. It wasn't fitting on the same page. And as I said before, references are used as a building block. So an example is in O'Sullivan and Downey's paper, there are references to Sinnott and Sikora's paper, and in Sinnott's 2010 work, he built off of one of Downey's previous works. I selected these articles because they were things that I was already reading, and because it is on a specific topic, it turns out that the articles I selected are all by the foremost experts on these individual topics, which is Bob better. So when I went to look at references and what was coming up repeatedly and the built off of research, all of these researchers just so happened to be interrelated with like the research that they were building off of, which was really interesting. And another way that they build credibility is adding acknowledgments. This can establish rigorous standards for academic writing in whatever field a writer is in. So they may talk about their peer reviewers, they may talk about any kind of other help that they've received, maybe from an institution, maybe from a museum. And that goes to show where they're getting their information from, that this is something that was rigorously reviewed, and it gives them a lot of credibility. So, in conclusion, although archaeology is a highly visible subject in the field of anthropology, journal articles and scholarly papers tend to be a less publicly consumable piece of it. And they also have highly segmented findings in order to best synthesize information. And the methods that they use are both characteristic of research paper and an exploratory synthesis paper. And then here are references to the articles that I talked about in this presentation. Thank you so much for watching. I also just want to make an acknowledgement of my own. I would like to express my sincere gratitude for my peer reviewers, Ian Stout and Maren Moffat, and my professor, Nona Brown.